Born into a family of jurists, Ibn Rushd was trained in law and became a judge in Seville and Cordoba. Around 1153 years, he was introduced by his friend, the philosopher Ibn Tufayl, to a prince of the Almohad court. There is a story that the prince asked him whether philosophers considered the world to be created in the time or eternal. A conversation that instigated Ibn Rushd commentaries on the Greek philosopher. The text of Ibn Rushd to be considered here is a commentary on the Poetics of Aristotle, translated into Latin in 1256 years by Hermanus Alminus, a monk living in Toledo. It was printed in 1481 years, the first version of Aristotle's text published during the Renaissance, not long after the death of Aristotle. The text of this Poetics effectively vanished for most of the late classical and early medieval periods. It was not known except through intermediaries such as Aristotle's Fulvio Theophrastus. The oldest surviving manuscript in the West dates from the 11th century. But this was not the version that influenced the medieval West. The version that had such an impact on the Middle Age was Arabic, a 10th century translation of a Greek manuscript dating before the years. This version departed considerably from the Western manuscript and is partly responsible for the altered form of Aristotle's ideas transmitted to Ibn Rushd's commentary. Also mentioned earlier, a philosopher such as Farabi, whose catalog of the sciences was twice translated into Latin and 12th century, followed that Greek commentator in viewing Aristotle's rhetoric and poetic as part of his original series of logical treatises, perceives thus. Favor as a faculty or method or treating language without any specific content as O.B. Hardison G.R. State. This interpretation ignores imitation, plot, characterization, catharsis, and most of the other subjects stressed by Aristotle in favor of. The imaginative syllogism, which was considered to be distinctive feature of poetry, inasmuch as this view is attributable to Ibn Rushd, however, it was somewhat modified, as well shall now see.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The next explanation is about imitative literature. Imitative literature. It is clear that Ibn Rushd places at least as much emphasis as Aristotle on the moral purpose and function of poetry. He places greater emphasis on the realistic nature of poetic imitation. This emphasizes correspondent with the greater weight that he accords to the affective element of poetry, the element of poetry that will produce an effect on the audience. In other words, unlike Aristotle, Ibn Rushd sees such realism or naturalism as directly increasing the affective and imaginative power and therefore the moral impact of poetry. From these sentences, given information that for Aristotle, a literature have emphasis on the purpose and function from the realistic nature of poetic imitation, that will effective element of poetry that will produce an effect on the audience element indirectly. So, for Aristotle, the representation to human being get effect from the literature or poetry that is from the realistic nature of poetic imitation, because this literature is just poetic imitation and indirect. It means give a probables because the representation itself which indirect, unlike Ibn Rushd that literature or poetic give a truth from poetry or literature. Even if Nurus tells the sense that literatures emphasize on the moral purpose and function of poetry, the word, unlike Aristotle, it gives a contrast between Aristotle and Ibn Rus. It make a contrast, and Ibn Rus adds that realism or naturalism is directly increasing the affective and imaginative power and therefore the moral impact of poetry in representation. This originates from a reality according to Ibn Rus, and reality is a natural thing that which is experienced by humans and not by fantasy or imaginative or imagination, so as provide a direct representation that leads to moral impact in expression. It's also explained in a sentence. Ibn stipulated that when the poet describes things as they truly are, the imaginative stimulation is not in excess of the qualities of the things and their true natures. State that he states that the poet should describe things as they truly are. The truth from the poet that including and the poet the true nature beside the qualities of the things. Here, the object is not only the qualities but the phenomenon or action or even that relate to nature in realistic is part of the object, the poet itself. So the poet have a character on his or her poet. And then, like Aristotle's, Ibn Rus attribute the pleasure we receive from poetry to the fact that representation is natural to human being, and then we derive pleasure from image of thing. He adds that we also derive pleasure from matter and melody. From the representation, beside the moral impact that we got, but there's a pleasure received from the poetry that is from image of things, also matter and melody within the poetry. Therefore, Eliot adding that Ibn Rus also seems to recognize an internal connection between poetic representation and human emotion, based implicitly on a correspondence between the external world of object and the internal world of human perception. This is a connection between poetic representation and human emotion, according to Ibn Rus. Is that based to the implicitly the external and internal, he recognized a connection that is built in imitative literature, that are poetic representation and human emotion based implicitly on a correspondence between the external world of the object and the internal world of human perception. Therefore, this imitative literature is to find or identify the truth within the poetry of literature, as Ibn Rus said. So that's all from me, Naida Rahmatania. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Aristotle has distinguished between elements intrinsic to poetry, such as mode of representation, plot, and character, and those elements which were extrinsic or belong to the performance of the play or poem. Ibn Rus rehearses Aristotle's distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic elements of poetry, using these two factors, imitation or representation and melody, as the basis of the distinction. In general, he acknowledged that the poet's skill in both of these domains will affect an audience. The various features of performance make the language more representational. Having said this, he tends to agree with Aristotle that the skilled poet does not rely on extrinsic performative aids. Indeed, poetic speeches that express truth vividly do not external enhancement. A tragedy, says Ibn Rus, should achieve its effect through representation. In general, Ibn Rus holds that excellence in poetic composition derives from two factors, arrangement and magnitude. Regarding the former, Poetry should imitate nature and harbor a single subject and a single end. As the for the latter, it should also have, as Aristotle had suggested, a definite magnitude, being neither too large nor too small for the audience's perception and understanding. In this way, the representation as a whole will have a unity comprising a beginning, middle, and end.
Ibn Rushd divides speech into logical, non-logical, and representational speech. He defines poetry as a variation of truthful or standard speech. The variation that occurs in poetry is through alteration of the meanings of words, the use of ornament, rhyme, and unfamiliar diction. He takes as his starting point Aristotle's view that poetry should engage in a moderate use of metaphorical and figurative language such that it will not degenerate into commonplace speech. Ibn Rushd also measures poetry by the standards of prose and sees rhetoric as a special type of prose. Ibn Rushd might have fueled, or at least reinforced, the tendency to situate poetry as either grammar or rhetoric, and at one point, dividing entirely from Aristotle's explanation of the quantitative components of tragedy, he states that Arab poems are divided into a rhetorical exerdium, the body of the praise itself, and a rhetorical conclusion. And according to him, poetry takes on some of the function of philosophy, logic, and rhetoric. He defines the discourse style as one where the speech offers where the speech offers open truth and is clear. Poetry is accredited with the goals of convincing and promoting understanding through the use of speech which is clear and departs minimally and rationally from standard speech. Ibn Rushd treatise is archetypal of scholastic views of poetry, situating it as one form of discourse among a hierarchy of discourses and at whose pinnacle stood theology. Just as Virgil and the Bible were referred as authoritative texts stylistically and grammatically as well as in their content, so the Quran is invoked as literary exemplar. Unlike Aquinas, Ibn Rushd accords poetry an important moral function and an epistemological function. So, what would later medieval and Renaissance thinkers and writers have gleaned about Aristotle from Ibn Rushd's text? Well, certainly, and the emphasis on the moral function and the truth value of poetry. A stress on unified poetic organization and the need for poetry to produce a powerful impact on its audience. The notion of poetry as one discourse intimately related to other discourses, overlapping considerably with rhetoric and logic. In the 16th century, Ibn Rushd's interpretation of Aristotle's Poetics, though highly distorted, was congenial to moralistic attitudes of the humanist. It was used extensively by critics such as Benvenuto da Imola, who saw Dante's Commedia as essentially a work of praise and blame. The tension between Aristotelian and humanist criticism reached explicit opposition in the work of Ludovico Castelvetro. Ironically, owing to a complex combination of historical circumstances, Ibn Rushd was for a long time given more credit than the views of Aristotle himself.